CRD in context. In light of the upcoming election, we've invited some candidates from provincial ridings in the CRD. So my first guest today is Adam Olsen, the BC Green Party's candidate for North Saanich and the Islands. Thanks for your time today.
You're welcome. Saanich North in the Islands.
Saanich North in the Islands, my mistake. Apologies.
No problem.
So Adam, number of issues, we'll get as far as we can through them.
Okay.
Possibly the most significant issue in the CRD that is impacted by provincial and in this case federal jurisdiction is the approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion. So what was your initial response to that?
Well, it's certainly a very large issue in Saanich North in the Islands, with so many of the southern Gulf Islands impacted by the shipping routes and the shipping zones. Clearly there's a massive issue in our riding, so much shoreline. As you may know, I was an intervener in the Trans Mountain Pipeline National Energy Board hearings, and so I've got some firsthand experience in participating in that. And the decision that was made by Prime Minister Trudeau, I think, was faulty in so many ways, in many ways. Primarily balancing precariously the decision on science, I think, is highly problematic for the federal Liberals, and will deeply impact the southern Gulf Islands, the Saanich Peninsula, and the Salish Sea. So I'm not happy with the decision.
So as a result of the decision, we're going to have now 35 tankers a month traveling off Vancouver Island rather than 5 a month, and they're carrying dilbit, diluted bitumen. Now, the island is getting several what they call new spill response centers, including one in Sydney and one at Beecher Bay with skimming and booming vessels. But are they going to provide an adequate response to, say, like a 500,000 barrel tanker disaster?
Well, the so-called science that this was based on doesn't even, we don't even understand how diluted bitumen behaves if it's spilled into salt water, into the ocean. We certainly don't know how it's going to behave if it's spilled into the Salish Sea, which is a unique environment in that there's so many suspended sediments. A lot of sediment comes down the Fraser River and spills into the Salish Sea. And one of the key issues that they identified was that when you have these suspended sediments, the sands and the silt hanging around, that this diluted bitumen could latch onto it or connects with it and sinks. So, what's really telling to me is that we've been shipping diluted bitumen through the Salish Sea at one tanker a month, about, I guess, roughly.
One a week.
One a week already. And none of this response capacity was in place. The federal and the provincial government, in my opinion, have been acting irresponsibly in allowing this activity to continue without having the scientific understanding, but as well not having the spill response capacity. So they've clearly attached the spill response capacity to the increased activity, more, a 500% increase in the diluted bitumen traveling through the Salish Sea. They needed that anyway. No, I don't have a lot of confidence based on the fact that we don't know how it's going to behave. How do you prepare for that?
That was when, anything that I've read about dilbit, I'm not an expert, just, your average layperson reading here and there. But, like you've mentioned, it's not like refined petroleum products such as diesel. And that it doesn't seem to lend itself to being boomed or skimmed off the surface. So the notion that we're going to have, 2 new boom vessels and 3 new skimmer vessels would be great if what was in the tankers lent itself to being cleaned up in that manner. But as you say, the properties of dilbit, they aren't well known. What's going to happen in various environments? Is the dilbit going to, semi-submerge, go down 10 feet, 20 feet? Is it going to sink to the bottom? In terms of what they're doing, the largest dilbit spill so far, I think, has been in the Kalamazoo River 6 years ago. It was 25,000 barrels, and as far as I know, they're still trying to clean that up.
Yeah, and covering it up has been part of what I think the problem was. They've tried to cover up the bitumen to pretend like it's not there. to some extent. I would suggest that the booming and the skimming resources that they're proposing to put are going to be very valuable to the South Coast. There's an increase in shipping traffic, and there's a lot of questions about noise and the impact on the surrounding marine environment by an increase, and not just of oil tankers, but of just shipping traffic in general. There's a lot of petroleum products that are moving through the Saanich Sea that those particular units that they're going to bring in could help. Bunker fuel that fuels the ships, as an example, or some refined product that's being moved around. But no, I don't have any confidence that the resources that they're going to put in place will have the ability. That the process that I saw play out, the information, the evidence that I heard and saw put forward during the National Energy Board hearing gives me very little confidence that this increase in skimming and booming and response capacity will have very little effect on a diluted bitumen spill. Basically, the Rain Coast Conservation Society put out a map of what would happen if a spill happened at Turn Point, and you're basically looking at the entire Saanich Sea and the Strait of Juan de Fuca being lost for a generation or more.
So my assumption is that the federal government would not have secured what they call the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. They wouldn't have I don't think they would. My assumption is they wouldn't have secured that agreement with 90% of the provinces without providing Alberta a new pipeline to Canadian Tidewater. Is that your assumption? Would they have got the deal without the approval of Kinder Morgan?
Look, this kind of horse trading, I think, is quite dangerous. We need to look at climate change for the issue that it is, and we need to address it. If we're going to be responsible decision makers and responsible government addresses climate change because it's an issue, the kind of horse trading that you're suggesting and that I've heard others suggest as well, I think is irresponsible. Now, the question you ask is, would they have been able to secure it? I think that probably there would have been some issues with oil-producing provinces, for sure, that there was probably some horse trading going on. But I think that the deal, the addressing climate change, needs to happen aside from the desire of a couple of provinces, a few provinces in Western Canada getting a specific product to market. I just don't see that as being responsible governance.
But isn't that part of it? What politics is all about, is making those sorts of deals if you want to stay in power?
Sure it is, but I just don't understand how you can say that we're going to increase access to fossil fuels, which are increasing climate change, and then that's going to be part of the solution. On one hand, you're increasing it. On the other hand, you're saying that we've got a climate change action going on the other side. In the end, I just don't think it's a good deal. I think that we should address climate change because it's a reality and that we have to address it, and that my kids are going to look back at this decision and say that, I think that we could have done a better job at it.
Okay, so for you it's fairly cut and dry in terms of you can't invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure at the same time that you're claiming to address mitigating greenhouse gas emissions.
I just think that investing in fossil fuel extraction and the piping technology, the shipping technology that's in place commits us to another 40, 50 years of burning fossil fuels. The large fossil fuel companies that are extracting in Alberta and Saskatchewan are going to be doing everything they can to fill those pipes, which I think sort of break down that argument.
Okay, so switch gears here to another CRD issue that's impacted by provincial jurisdiction. That's amalgamation. So in the last municipal election, a large majority of voters seemed to support an in-depth regional study of amalgamation. What we seemed to get was a fairly short study of shared services that's going to come out later this month or early next month. So in terms of responding to what voters had asked for, is that a fair response?
I don't think so. To me, I think that that having a governance review is important. I think that it's important that we are able to take a look at the governance structures that we've got and ask the question, and have any studies that we do answer the question, are we being well served by the structure that's in place? I was a part of the municipal council in Central Saanich when this discussion first came on the radar. I know that in Central Saanich we were a part of that discussion. I was thankful that the 3 municipalities on the Saanich Peninsula asked the same question, or very, very similar question, I think the most similar question to any of the neighbors that any of the municipalities did. What I'm hoping is that that politicians, primarily local government politicians, don't see this as being a threat to their municipality or a threat to their communities, but rather, are we being well served by the governance structures that are in place? And if not, then what can we do to make sure that those governance structures are serving the people, the constituents, well? I think the part of the problem with the discussion that happened with amalgamation was that there was an assumption that amalgamation was the most desirable end result. I think when we go into that governance study, we need to have a completely open mind. We have to be able to say, is this structure serving us? And if not, what structure would be put in place that would best serve the citizens? And part of the problem with the conversation that happened before the last municipal election was that it was assumed that amalgamation was going to be the best solution, and so it focused people around that discussion, when amalgamation is one of potentially many outcomes.
So if this look at this investigation of the study of shared services, does it have a broad enough scope to conclude that amalgamation, or some degree of amalgamation, would be a solution?
Well, I haven't seen the terms of reference, so I don't know that it's got a broad enough scope, but what I can say is that there's a lot of shared services in the region now, and not just with the CRD, agreements between various municipalities for various services. I mean, if you take a look at the fire services as an example on the Saanich Peninsula, I've been meeting with the fire chiefs as part of my most current campaign, and one of the things that I found out was that the 3 fire services, of 3 volunteer fire services on the Saanich Peninsula, work very, very well together, and they're able to maintain a volunteer fire service within those municipalities. The question that could be asked there is, if there was an amalgamation, or if those 3 services together, would it be a volunteer service, and would the citizens on the Saanich Peninsula receive the kind of value that they're getting from a volunteer service? And I think that this is part of the challenge with it being focused on amalgamation, is that there's so much unknown there that I don't think that the municipal politicians, I don't think that the citizens really clearly have all the information in front of them to be able to say, yeah, amalgamating into 1 or 3 or 5 or whatever the number is better than the current system that we've got. So I think that a study in looking at whether or not certain services can be shared, and that the benefits of that would be passed off to the local government taxpayers, I think it's a good exercise, but I think that it probably should run a little bit deeper to the governance structures rather than just the services.
Okay. In terms of another issue that's come up, it's the Steelhead LNG in partnership with Malahat First Nation is proposing a floating LNG facility at the old Bamberton cement plant site on Saanich Inlet. Some nearby residents believe that the proposal is quite impractical because it involves an underwater pipeline coming from northern Washington to the site. So, will this thing ever get built?
I don't know that this thing will ever get built, but that has been a message that I've been hearing right since August 2015 when they first announced it, and I came out and said I in no way can support a gas liquefaction plant in the Saanich Inlet. It's an insane place to put it. People said to me, don't worry about it. It's not ever going to happen. It is an insane place to do it. It's a ridiculous, absurd project. Don't worry about it. I think that it is important for the people that live around the Saanich Inlet, including I think all of the people in the CRD are impacted by this proposal, need to treat this as a very serious proposal until it in fact goes away. And I think resting on our laurels and saying, well, it's absurd, so it won't happen, I think is a mistake. There's lots of absurd projects that have happened, and I know that the folks in wood fiber in the Howe Sound never thought that a wood fiber LNG would be approved, and yet here we are with wood fiber LNG being approved. So the approach that I've taken with it is that Steelhead LNG is spending well, thousands, if not millions of dollars to put this project together, to do the research, to do the studies, to make a viable project. Why would we not treat it as serious as they are treating the investment that they're making?
Yeah, just have a couple of minutes left here. On this file, so you're a member of the Sartlip First Nations.
Correct, yeah.
So when you oppose a development that's supported by another First Nation or nations, such as the Malahat, and I guess it's the same for the Kinder Morgan in terms of, it was supported by some First Nations on Vancouver Island. What kind of position does that put you in? Do you have an advantage by being a First Nations member yourself, or does it put you at a disadvantage?
I know a lot of people felt uncomfortable because Malahat was making a partnership with a company that was saying that it was going to create jobs and economic development for that particular First Nation. I think that there was, on behalf of Steelhead, an intense amount of, a lot of sloppiness in their lack of taking the time to understand the Saanich Inlet as a much more complex place. You can't just make a partnership with Malahat and ignore the 4 First Nations on the Saanich Peninsula who also have Douglas Treaty, Aboriginal rights, inherent rights in the Saanich Inlet, and it's just not good enough to make a partnership with one of them and say, well, we're great at doing First Nations relationships. I think that it's also important to say that you don't have to support every project just because a First Nation has engaged in it. A bad project is a bad project, and so this particular I'm not going to oppose all the economic development proposals that the Malahat bring forward, but ones that I find to be that impact the rights of the Sartlip, the rights of the Saanich, the impact the surrounding non-First Nations, non-Indigenous neighborhoods. I think we have to be able to stand up and say that's not a good project and I don't support it.
Adam, I didn't get through half the issues here, but I really do appreciate your time coming in today.
There is
Thanks
a lot
very
of
much.
issues. Thanks a lot.
That concludes this section of the CRD in Context. My next guest today is John Treleaven. John is the Vice Chair of a group called the Grumpy Taxpayers of Greater Victoria. Thanks for coming in today, John.
Pleasure. Thank you for the
Appreciate your
invitation.
time. So your group is dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable municipal government. So what's the relationship between those three things? Lower taxes, less waste, and more accountability.
What really holds it all together is accountability and governance. Lower taxes, we're not about cutting taxes. We're absolutely have a strong belief in the need for strong public policy formulation and public activity on issues that the public defines as being of broader consequence to society. But what we get a little bit upset about from time to time is when taxpayers' resources are wasted. We get particularly exercised if very good people running these institutions run up against institutional barriers to the very success they've been elected to achieve. And our tagline is almost the best place on earth, and Greater Victoria is one of the best cities in the world to live in by Richard Florida's standards. It's a creative community, it's a global city, it's a $15 billion economy that reaches the world. Butchard's Gardens is Victoria's brand, but you name it, the universities, Viking Aviation, there's huge businesses here that take us to the world. Well, those businesses to succeed require an efficient platform in which to establish and grow their businesses for the benefit of all of us. And that's really where we're coming from.
So it's interesting though. I guess, you know, if waste and accountability are really the key issues for you, which they sound like they are, you wouldn't have a group. You can't have a group called the Grumpy Want More, you know, accountability and less waste of Greater Victoria. It doesn't have the same bite as Taxpayers. So Taxpayers is very concrete. You know, I can identify.
Yes.
Everybody else can identify. But does it give the public like, you know, when we first spoke, I was surprised to find out that, you know, being grumpy about taxes is not really your first and foremost concern. Your first and foremost concern is waste and accountability.
That's right. It's respect for taxpayers' dollars.
Okay.
It's respect for the taxpayers who are the voters. It's respect for the fact that there is only one taxpayer. You know, most political jurisdictions fight the tax battle as if there were two. We can tax business or we can tax people. Mm-hmm. Businesses never pay a tax. They collect taxes on behalf of all three levels of government. From who? Mm-hmm. You and I.
Right.
Now, Victoria has the wonderful benefit, as I said before, of being an externally focused economy. So, in fact, we share our tax burden with the world. Every tourist that comes to Victoria, 1 million visitors a year to Butcher Gardens, every time Viking Aviation sells a plane, every time the gaming businesses and the universities, every time they attract a foreign student, mm-hmm. they're sharing the tax burden here. But it all comes down to the citizens, the voters, and the individual.
So in terms of waste, which is one of your primary focus, so what's an example or two of waste of taxpayers' money that particularly makes you grumpy?
66 years for this community to decide whether it needs or should have or really needs a sewage treatment system. The CRD was created 50 years ago at about the same time as, I believe, the first kind of study of the impact of sewage treatment and stuff mm-hmm. in Victoria was published. It should have taken 66 years, 50 years rather in case CRD, to come to a solution. And as you know, in the end, the province had to step in. Mm-hmm. Now, that is not a comment on anybody sitting at that CRD board of directors. It is a comment on how they sit there. The absence of region-wide elections for any position. And if you look at the instructions that the province has written for municipal councillors sitting on regional bodies, chapter whatever it is, 16 says you will vote the interests of your municipality. Well, that's fine, except that if that's all you have, if no one is elected region-wide, if no region-wide issues are ever discussed or ever voted upon regionally, you have 50 years to make a sewage decision, because everybody comes to the table, it's not a criticism, with one view in mind: how do I protect Saanich? And a city of 378,000 people, an economy of $15 billion, needs something better than that. And I mean, I would say for sure that the CRD is it's a very interesting and good institution if at that board table perhaps only just the chair of the CRD was elected across the CRD. Otherwise, it's very difficult, and I appreciate it very much, it's very difficult for those directors to fulfill the role, which is why the province looks at the CRD as just a committee. But what this region needs, where we've got 13 vibrant, vital, well-led municipalities that rub into each other all the time, there's got to be something above that that actually has regional authority. And as we saw with sewage, eventually the province had to step in.
They did on that. And so in terms of another piece I pulled down from your website was a commitment to providing and supporting constructive alternatives to what's being offered up. So are there any alternatives in terms of constructive alternatives to, let's say, a new Johnson Street Bridge or right now the wastewater treatment facility? What would be a constructive alternative?
Well, I mean, with the Johnson Street Bridge, we need a regional transportation vision and plan. This is a city of 378,000 people where there is no plan. It's all transactional. And people suffer. I mean, years ago, and I believe it was actually the Highways Department that pulled the money from the Mackenzie interchange. Well, the province saved a whole lot of money, whatever it was, 25 years ago. But how many million tons of CO2 have gone into the environment? How many hundreds of thousands of man hours have been wasted in traffic? That's a decision that, had there been a regional transportation plan, would never have been taken. And as we sit here right now, you look at the Keating overpass. I mean, school buses make a left turn every day across a highway because there's no Keating overpass, and somehow it is Central Saanich's role to get that built. Wait a minute, it's a provincial highway. If there was a regional transportation plan, the 13 mayors and councils would tell the Highways Department what to do. The 13 municipalities, because I'm not talking amalgamation, but they should have that plan. At the moment they don't.
So everything more or less bumps back up to this absence of that.
Yes, and let's understand. I mean, everybody understands this, and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but in the recent past, one of the more remarkable achievements of the mayors has been to meet separately from the CRD and create the South Island Prosperity Project. This city now has an economic development unit funded from the private sector, from the federal government actually, in program terms, and I think 10 of the 13 municipalities. Great. They knew it couldn't happen at the CRD table, so they met separately. And I think that that same kind of approach will be taken on regional transportation. Okay, when we were looking at the 50th anniversary of the CRD, all we were asking for was kind of a root and branch study of what works, what doesn't work, how could it be improved, instead of just cake and balloons. 50th anniversary, you tend to go back to the first principles and see what's happening. Very talented people on the CRD, you just interviewed one, working in a system that, I mean, they don't even raise their own tax revenue. As you know, that their budget has to be approved by 13 municipalities. That's difficult. Oh yeah, and one other small thing, as we know, the chair of the CRD gets a 12-month term. This is a region with a $15 billion economy, $1 billion in operating budgets, $1 billion in debt, and 378,000 people, and the chair of the CRD has a 12-month term. You couldn't run Shaw Cable that way.
Another phrase that caught my attention there is what seems to be lacking in many of the municipalities is a culture of frugality. So, you know, as you say, making do or even using duct tape. Okay, so who's responsible for the culture at a municipal level?
Well, I mean, the mayor and council have to set the tone and the direction of the community. And I think it's probably true generally that because the municipal tax base all across Canada is the most secure, that a number of municipalities unconsciously engage in cost-plus budgeting, as opposed to what we're recommending, try zero-based budgeting for a change. And if you look, well, the CFIB just published a report on the 20 major municipalities in the province. If you look at their curves, you have in most cases the population being fairly stable. We're in a very low inflation era, so for the last 10, 12 years, inflation has been sometimes below 1, but it's been 1% to 2%. Municipal budgets have gone up about 30% during that period. By the way, right through the worst economic recession that you and I hopefully will ever experience in our lifetime. Well, why the disconnect? The provincial government had to cut back during the recession. The federal government, God knows, did. But municipalities, not just here, were able to keep on going. Well, there's a time when you do the compounding and you've got a real problem. And right now, I think Victoria has recommended 2.48, something like that, or 2.9% increase.
In that neighborhood.
And the police budget, I think, is 4.84 increase. Doesn't sound like much until you're up against fairly stable population and fairly stable inflation.
Inflation rate.
And when you ask municipal councils about the CPI, they just, So more transparency. What's driving municipal budgets? For the most part, I mean, we're dealing with, of course, major infrastructure projects around here, but for the most part, it's personnel costs, labor costs. Well, deal with that. I don't know a recommendation, but if 70% of your budget is personnel and your budget's gone up 30% in the last 10 years as against an inflation rate of like 1, something's got to be done. And the other issue, of course, is that all municipalities across Canada, it's not just here, provide the property taxpayer with a mill rate multiple of 1, and businesses with a mill rate multiple of up to, in the case of, I think, Vancouver, it's over 5. So when you look at that 30% increase in the CFIB report, think if you're running a business. That curve has gone like that. And all that money you've had to collect from your customers by being more and more competitive. It's a very difficult environment.
It's a difficult environment. One of the better definitions I've heard, going back to this notion of the absence of a culture of frugality at the municipal level, one of the better descriptions I've heard of culture is it's just the way we think around here. So well, number one, how do you go about changing the way in which a collective thinks?
Okay, well, first of all, I would say for all the municipalities in British Columbia, tomorrow morning, go and take a look at the staff directory in the lobby of your town hall. You will find the slavish adherence to the alphabet. In the case of Sydney, it's administration and then mayor and council. In the case of Saanich, it's mayor right under licenses dog. Now, when you go to the BC legislature, it's the premier and the members of the legislature up top. Then the alphabet takes over. Change, though, I mean, don't spend the money, but change the signs, change the mentality. The thought on that signage is, well, they're just like us. No, they are the board of directors of the community.
Right.
And from then, make sure that that the organization is being run properly and directed properly, and that there is no confusion between the role of the council, the CAO, and the staff. All collaborative. Don't get me wrong here. All collaborative. But if you think that the mayor and council aren't in charge, what does the signage say?
Yeah, so the signage suggests that they aren't.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so you change that. Going back to the way of thinking here, again, from your website, it's rare that things change unless we think differently and are prepared to challenge the status quo. Now, you gave us this one small example of, reordering the way in which the services and the personnel are listed coming into City Hall. But in terms of the beliefs that you hold and your group, pardon me, in terms of those beliefs that you hold and think from, you think quite differently than they do down at City Hall. What are the major differences between your beliefs and those that seem to be collectively held by our elected representatives?
Well, I think everybody understands the compact between the voter, the taxpayer, and all three levels of government. So no question about that. What I would say is that to maybe break some of the way we've always done it mentality, our recommendation is for cities, for departments within cities, to try a zero-based budgeting approach. Challenge the staff. The staff know they're very, very capable people, but challenge them in an environment which says, next year we are not going cost plus. Now, to give them credit, where credit is due, the town of Sydney last year, their property tax increase on residential property was 0.91%. Mm-hmm. So they didn't end years of growth, but they certainly bent the curve.
Which was well below the 2%
They
inflation
did
rate.
not do that easily. They obviously mobilized their staff, the mayor and the council and the CAO. That's what needs to go on here, because it is happening more and more that the taxes are becoming unaffordable. And this is the only province, and it's the only tax that I can voluntarily say I won't pay it anymore. I'll just borrow it from the provincial government, and then when I sell my house, I'll pay it off. You can't do that with sales tax. You can't do it with your income tax. Why is it here that you can do it with your property tax? And that's kind of a relief. Oh, okay, we've got a safety valve. No, we don't want that safety valve. You want the municipal taxpayer to, of course, contribute to the costs of running the municipality, in this case, whether it's the CRD or the individuals, have the satisfaction of knowing that they are participating and that the services are the ones they really need and are affordable. That's what we need.
Okay. I've got less than about 30 seconds left here. I'm just going to ask you one quick question on amalgamation. Are you hopeful about the current study that isn't looking at amalgamation, it's only looking at shared services?
I'm not that hopeful.
Okay.
I'm not that hopeful. I think there should be the study. I would like it to be hard-edged. I'd like the province to have learned from the sewerage issue and how they had to manage it, to come in and say, we got to avoid that in the future. And I'll make one very specific suggestion for the people running that study. Publish a list of integrated systems that have had to be abandoned because the funding mechanisms fell apart, like one 911 center. It's not going to work.
Okay. John Treleaven of the Grumpy Taxpayers of Greater Victoria, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
That concludes this segment of the CRD in Context. My final guest today is Alex Dutton. Alex is the BC Liberal Party's candidate for Oak Bay Gordon Head. Alex, thanks for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate you coming in. So I'm just going to get through as many of these CRD issues as I can, but possibly the most significant issue in the CRD that is impacted by provincial or and in this case federal jurisdiction is the approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion. So what was your initial response to the decision?
I was surprised based on Prime Minister Trudeau's campaign that it was approved, but from that political standpoint, not necessarily from the scientific and policy standpoint. I think we know that the federal jurisdiction over this area has to address issues of national importance, and when you're talking about interprovincial trade and getting goods to market, you have to consider the entire country. And that's, I think, what he did.
So it was a decision made in the national interest as opposed to just BC's?
Yes, I think he's looking at, I can only speculate, obviously, but we know that these goods will go to market, and they want to go to market, and we know that it's safer to send it by pipeline than it is by rail. And there's also an opportunity cost there. So railway cars that are not being filled with oil and gas are being filled with things like potash or grain from the prairies. So there's sort of a number of different factors at play. Often in government you see that issues are more complex than just yes or no, yes pipeline, no pipeline. And this one is particularly complex because we do have an incredible coastline that we need to protect. But the other thing we need to consider is what are the economic ramifications. And as someone who grew up bugging her parents to recycle and turn off the lights, I remember what it means to have a safe coastline. And in this case, what we're looking at here is, I think, the best option of the options available.
Okay, so the option that's been approved is basically going to increase tanker traffic off southern Vancouver Island from 5 tankers a month to 35, and then they carry dilbit, diluted bitumen. And one of the federal government's response to protecting the coastline is to put in new spill response centers. There's 5 of them, one at Beecher Bay, one up in Sydney. But do you think that the spill response centers are going to be an adequate protection against a 500,000 barrel tanker disaster involving dilbit?
So, to be clear, any disaster is too much, right? The damage to the environment is undeniable. But what we know in this case is that the ships that we're dealing with are double-hulled. They're each going to have 2 to 3 tugboats that go along with them. And it's not as if it's a free-for-all out there. It's not like Heathrow Airport without an air traffic controller. Transport Canada oversees the comings and goings of all the ships. In addition, once they enter Canadian waters, Transport Canada sends out a pilot who is trained specifically in this geographic area and knows all the ins and outs. So we're not talking about ships that are, first of all, we're not talking about ships that are single-hulled. We're talking about ships that are double-hulled. And second of all, those ships are not being captained by people who don't know the local area. When the Premier set out her 5 conditions, the second of which was a world-class marine spill response, because obviously that is a primary concern. The difficulty we have as a province is that we do not regulate that. The federal government does. And so I know that this is going to be an issue in the provincial election coming up because it's the first opportunity the electorate has to respond to the decision. But it needs to be remembered that what the province can do, it has done. And that a lot of this concern and a lot of the issues that are being raised are properly addressed in Ottawa.
At the federal level. Going back to what you said earlier in terms of it being made in a decision that's made in the national interest. So my assumption is that the federal government would not have secured the pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change with about 90% of the provinces if it hadn't provided Alberta with a new pipeline to Canadian tidewater. Is that your assumption? They wouldn't have got the overall climate change deal without approving the pipeline?
Well, again, I can't really speculate about national and interprovincial negotiation strategy for the Prime Minister, but I imagine that Alberta, they have a strong case to make. Right now they're a half province, there are a number of other provinces that are struggling, and we have obligations to our citizens, both at a federal and national level. Or excuse me, both at a provincial and federal level.
So at the end of the day then, the risk associated with an increase in tanker traffic is worth it, given the fact that we have now have a pan-Canadian deal, and we have allowed Alberta to get its resources to tidewater.
Well, it's not just about Alberta getting its resources to the coast. It's also about British Columbians and British Columbians' opportunities around the job creation that happens with expansions of ports, with pipelines, and those things are of value to British Columbia. Again, when the Premier set out her 5 conditions, the first of which was environmental protection, the second was that marine spill question. And I think, to go back to your original question, the deal it's not just in Alberta's interests. I think it's in everybody's interest. Is the risk worth it, as you say? The risk has been managed, the risk is tolerable, and in this case, it's the appropriate decision.
Okay. Another issue that's, got provincial jurisdiction impact is amalgamation. So it's been around for some time,
yes.
The topic. But most recently the government, what happened in the last election is that a large majority of voters voted to have a study of amalgamation, I think 75%, something like that. They wanted an in-depth regional study of amalgamation. What they got was a fairly short study that looked at shared services, and that is going to be due out later this month. So in terms of what the voters had asked for in a referendum and what they got, was that being fair to the voters?
Democracy, as you know, is messy business. And yes, 75% overall wanted this study, but if you break that down, you have to realize that not every municipality was in favor. And this is a decision that the municipalities need to come to on their own measure. And again, I think the approach of Minister Fassbender of saying, okay, you want to see more service integration, you're uncomfortable with the idea of amalgamation, we aren't going to force you to do this. We have delegated authority to the municipalities and to the regional districts to provide local services, and we expect them to be responsible and to make decisions. So was it fair to the voters? I think this approach is fair to the voters because it also respects the voters who put in place municipal councils who don't want amalgamation. And I think there are 2 different ways there that the voters are being engaged, one at the provincial level and one at the municipal level. And so both substantively and procedurally, you are seeing that democratic respect.
Okay, do you think the study that's, like I say, out at the end of the month. Do you think that that might lead to, another study, a further study that would look more at amalgamation as opposed to shared services?
I mean, it might. We can
Okay.
we can speculate about what that report is going to say or not say. But again, I think the position of the provincial government, and one that I personally support, is that amalgamation is not going to be forced on anybody.
Yeah, I think that's been made clear since the issue, came to, arose, if you will, that it was never going to be forced. It was always going to be up to the voters, and that's why they were given the opportunity to vote on whether or not to have a study. So another issue that's, again, got provincial jurisdiction is the BC government's announcement that it's going to provide first-time homebuyers with an interest-free loan for up to 5 years of up to $37,000, $37,500 for a new home purchase. So what's the impact going to be on the CRD's housing market in terms of this program?
I think two things. One, I think we're going to see an increase in the number of people who can afford to purchase a home, which is fantastic. But the other thing is those people who can now purchase a home are going to leave rental suites vacant. And I think that's going to ease some of the pressure on that particular segment of the market and have more opportunity for people to find rental housing. And so I think there's sort of a micro and a macro benefit to the program.
So in terms of, so you're going to increase the number of buyers, but not increase the supply of homes. So is that going to just drive the housing market prices higher at the end of the day?
Well, it's a difficult thing because obviously the BC Liberal Party believes in free enterprise, and we don't. Our first instinct is not to interfere with the market. So, for instance, increasing demand, we can create the circumstances or the culture where that is available to construction and private enterprise, but we aren't prepared to go in and build the housing ourselves. That said, what we want to do here is enable young families, give them that little extra, right? This $37,500 is available to families that already have been approved for a first mortgage. So they just need that little extra push to get into the market. And we believe that these first-time homebuyers, as I said, are going to leave rental markets or rental homes, and so or rental suites, and that's going to allow other people to enter into those spaces. Now, to your question about the CRD housing market, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we live on an island, and so there's only so much space. That said, I know that with the increase in density that we're seeing in some of the downtown core, we know that there are more spaces coming online, and the more people that we can house, the better.
Okay. Again, another issue that has provincial jurisdiction attached to it is the fentanyl crisis. So last month, Health Minister Terry Lake announced the opening of a number of overdose prevention sites, some here in Victoria, but he did it without waiting for for federal permission, and the decision didn't seem to draw any flack from Ottawa. So in general, as an elected representative at a junior level, let's say you win provincially, what's your thinking on when someone should act in the absence of explicit senior government permission? I'm not asking you to second guess Minister Lake. Just in general, in terms of the relationship between the provincial government and the federal government.
You mentioned the word being elected to a junior level of government, and I guess I would have to take exception to that.
Okay.
I actually see the provincial government and the federal government as equals, but in sort of two separate spheres. And I think it's the obligation, I believe, of every government, fundamentally, to see people reach their potential and to enable them to do that. And so when people are in crisis, it's the government's responsibility to step up and step in. So in this case, Minister Lake saw what was an absolute crisis and continues to be a crisis. And he tried to act cooperatively with his colleagues in Ottawa, and he wasn't getting a response. And meanwhile, the people that he was responsible for and to were dying. And that is a public health crisis. People talk about SARS as being a public health crisis. The statistics we're dealing with this crisis are astronomically higher than that of what we dealt with SARS, and yet we didn't see any action from the federal government. So the provincial government thought strategically, what can we do? And an overdose prevention site is different and distinct than a supervised injection site. And that legal distinction and finding the thoughtful, strategic solution to that, well, maybe not solution, but harm reduction strategy that was available to them, and then acting on that, I think showed incredible leadership.
Yeah, it was an interesting one because the call was made on the basis of, you say, a public health crisis, and on the recommendation of our provincial health officer, Dr.
Perry Kendall.
Dr. Perry Kendall. Again, just with the time we've got left, see how many issues we can get through here. But Steelhead and LNG is in partnership with the Malahat First Nations, and they're proposing a floating LNG facility at the old Bamberton cement plant site on Saanich Inlet. And some nearby residents believe that the proposal is quite impractical given the requirement of an underwater gas pipeline from northern Washington to Bamberton. So what's your thought on this? Is this project ever going to get off the ground?
Well, we're in early stages, and as you said, it's a very complex project with a number of specific environmental concerns that relate to the area. The underwater pipeline, the narrowing of the inlet. I would hesitate to speculate on whether or not it's economically and environmentally feasible, and both of those things must be in place. That said, it's encouraging to see resource development work with First Nations and go to them first and look for partnerships.
Well, there's the First Nations that they've partnered with, but then there are 4 First Nations on the other side of the inlet who are opposed to the development. So when it comes to developments such as this, where First Nations are involved, and it's the same thing with the Kinder Morgan approval, right? Some First Nations are in support of it, and others aren't. Me and you, as non-First Nations people, should we take a sort of a step back when First Nations are involved in these sorts of developments, in terms of allowing them to work it out amongst themselves, or should we sort of try to partner with First Nations that want to do what we want to do, either oppose it or are in support of it?
I guess I'd ask for clarification. And what do you mean by you and I, as private citizens or members
as
of
non-First Nations people?
I think
I'm making an assumption there that you're not First Nations.
No, not First Nations.
Okay.
As I said earlier, I was excited to see Steelhead deal directly with the Malahat First Nation, because I think that shows that First Nations are being brought to the table. It's not a consultation afterthought. Okay. It's a partnership. And so with that respect, no, I don't think that we should interfere. Now, as you said, there are other First Nations who aren't supportive, and they are they have every right to oppose. Now, I wouldn't interfere with that process, but I am thrilled to see all sides engaged and engaged directly with the First Nations.
Okay. I only have about 30 seconds left here. So what I'm going to do is just thank you for your time, because I don't have time to get into this next issue. But Alex, I really do appreciate you coming in, and best of luck in the election.
Thank you so much for your time.
That concludes this section of the CRD in Context.